Okay, so we will start the next session. So we are going to further discuss the dynamics in the brain, also in relationship to deep neural networks. So this is a presentation by Kai and Daniel. So together with Gianbo, we have been so lucky to work with them on a project where we are linking brain data to deep neural network. And this is a project that is funded by the SMQB. But we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Ali. Sorry, I don't want to stand directly in front of you. Yeah, so I'll be talking about a project which we've been working on, looking at dynamics of visual processing in the human brain and artificial neural network. Okay, yeah, so before we get started, this is a collaborative project between the Department of Computer Science and the Center for Human Brain Health, as well as being supported by the Institute for Interdisciplinary Data Science and AI, which is where I'm based. And we also have had help from Siano Win, who conducted the experiment that I'll show and did the data pre-processing. And as part of the SMQB support, we've had this artist, Alex Billingham, who's been embedded with the project for the last 7 months and produced the video, which you've been watching. So yeah, in this talk, I'll quickly describe what we'll talk about. So we're looking at the priming effect in visual processing, visual object recognition. And so I'll talk about that for a bit. And then we're using an RSA paradigm. I've already heard some about that, so I won't spend too much time on that. And then Dan will talk about the artificial neural network model of object recognition, which we've been using. And then I'll talk about how we're using that to sort of unpick the dynamics of the priming effect. And then we'll talk about where we're going next. Yeah, so this is a sort of project in progress. These are preliminary results and some future directions. So yeah, priming effect is what we're talking about. So have a look at the fixation cross in the center of the screen there. So that's an example of one of the trials in the experiment that was run. So here the participants saw 2 pairs of rapidly presented images parafoveally, followed by a single image foveally presented. And the image that was foveally presented was either primed by the same image having been presented just before, or it was primed in a 2-back case. We just heard about N-back priming paradigm, or it had been unprimed in each trial. And the one that you just saw was this one where it was 1-back primed. So our priming effect is a measured change in behavior or in brain recording signal when the stimulus is primed versus when it isn't. So in the behavioral case, that might be faster or more accurate reactions or decision making. And in the brain signal, one example of this would be repetition suppression, another thing that we've just heard about, which is where the recorded signal is lower in the case where the image has just been presented. So in this example, just summing over the entire meg sensors, I guess this indicates these are the meg sensors over the visual area. In the 1-back case, we have the grand average being reduced. Although interestingly, in the 2-back case, the grand average returns almost to normal cases. So in this sort of setup, it seems like we've got a kind of sweet spot when you're looking at the whole scalp or large numbers of sensors of priming in the 1-back case. Another kind of priming effect, which Ollie's mentioned, which is related to this, is sharpening. So it's not just lesser activation, but it's sort of more specific or more efficient activation, where the overall level might be lower, but it might come on faster, or it might be easier to decode properties of the experimental condition from the sort of activation patterns. We want to explore both of these effects using a deep model of image recognition. So before we get to that, I'll talk about RSA briefly. So this is a selection of the images that were used as stimuli in the experiment. And there's lots of different ways that these images could be represented by a model or by a different region or process in the brain. So one example would be picking out colors from the image. This is sort of a low-level perceptual property of the pixels in the image. But another way might be a higher level conceptual or semantic property, like the category of object shown in the image. These are the 5 categories that were covered by our experiment. And so a model like this can be encoded in the RSA paradigm with one of these RDMs, as Roger talked about in the first talk. So here, to encode the object category as the model, all of the cells which represent the similarity or the dissimilarity between pairs of stimuli would be 0 in the case that they are part of the same category, indicating that they're effectively identical, or 1 in the case where they're in different categories, indicating that there's no other structure going on. So this model in the RSA paradigm is extremely simple, but it captures a kind of categorical clustering in the space. So the RDMs like this, as well as coming from simple category model, could also come from a more complicated computational model of the stimuli or from brain data. And that's the way in which we can compare models and brain data to see how well the model's view of the stimuli matches the brain's view. So when we use this in our MEG study of participants looking at these triplets of image presentations using the category model, we want to look at when does that model explain the data. So we generate an RDM from brain data in a similar way, although now because it's MEG data, we have an RDM that is dynamic. It changes over time, over the epoch of the recording. And then we look at when does this brain-based RDM, when is it best explained by the model RDM? And in this case, we have that before the foveal image is presented, it basically doesn't explain the data. That's good, that's expected. You can't decode the category of the image before it's been seen. And then after the foveal presentation of that image, the category model starts to explain the data well. It suggests that about 400 milliseconds, you've got a kind of maximal category information being represented in the brain. And I'll just reiterate that this is over all MEG sensors. It's a whole brain data. Okay, now I'll hand over to Dan to do next.
Right, so we're using an artificial neural network as sort of a comparative, very simplistic model of what the brain is doing, basically. So the way these are set up, if you don't already know, it's a layered network of these nodes that are meant to represent virtual neurons, and they're sort of connected together by these edges or weights. And these weights they have a strength which is learned during some training era. And these layers are stuck together, and you feed in some visual input at the start, for example, like an image, like that image of a digit, and it feeds through the network and gives you some classification output at the end, like what number is in the image. And when I say activations, what I mean is, given some image, what's the activation pattern across the whole network? How are these cells lighting up, basically? And how does this correlate with maybe what's happening in the brain? So an activation map, for example, would be, let's say I take this video of a tiger and I feed it in like one frame at a time into a common visual architecture, and I read out what the layers are actually picking up on, what features are they actually reacting to, basically. And we can see the lower layers of the network are kind of expected to respond to like the low-level visual features of the image, like edges and shapes and textures. And then the higher level layers of the network are meant to be responding to more semantic features like categories and detections of specific, like an animal, like a tiger or something like that. So as I said earlier, these models can be trained in different ways. And I think we've already heard a little bit more about supervised versus self-supervised learning in previous talks. But just to reiterate, supervised learning is we have some labeled data set like ImageNet, where you have 1 million different images and like 1,000 different image classes that they belong to, and each image is labeled. And the model is basically just learning to map image to class label. An example of this is like AlexNet, which is quite popular pre-trained network. On the other hand, you have the self-supervised learning, which is you have some data set which you don't have annotated human labels, but you use some auxiliary task by corrupting the data in some way, and you use the network to try and learn to uncorrupt it in some way. And you'd hope that this learns more natural visual features maybe. And it's a far more scalable method because you don't need annotated data. So with these two things in mind, what are we trying to tackle? There's two questions. Are the activations and the representations being generated in the network similar to what the brain's doing? And also, what are the dynamics involved? We've seen this suppression and potentially sharpening being mentioned in previous talks. How can we try to implement that in our networks, basically?
Oh yeah, so from AlexNet, which is the network that we have begun with, we can build different model RDMs from selected layers throughout the depth of AlexNet. And here you can see some of these layers. So this is, correct me if I'm wrong, this is the input layer going up all the way to the output layer, which is making a category choice out of the images that we fed it, same images from the experiment. And you can see here that the sort of categorical structure emerges as you move up the layer hierarchy. So what we're going to do is the same analysis that I showed you before with that pure category model, but now we're going to use each of the individual layer models to correlate with the brain, the dynamic brain RDMs. So the results here are that all of the different layers explain the data well after the image is presented, but not all at the same time. So you can see before the image is presented, again, essentially no correlation between what the model is giving us and the brain. And then afterwards, we have seemingly a sort of changing effect here. So initially, the lower layers, which are in the paler sort of orangey colors, explain the data very well, peaking at like about 150 milliseconds after the image is presented. And then this seems to, I don't have a cursor, this low sort of perceptual representation decays. Meanwhile, the more semantic representations given by the higher layers in purple take over in the later period, about 300 to 600 milliseconds afterwards. So from this, I'm going to just sort of define the sort of early period and late period for the follow-up analysis. And the first question that we want to ask is there actually difference between these models? Do some models explain the data better than others? And the answer is yes. I used an area under the curve analysis in this early and late period and found, I'm not showing all of this significant differences here, just sort of picking out a few to show you that there's a lot of separation between the different depth layers of the model. And in the early period, it's the early layers that fit best. And in the later period, it's the later layers that fit best, although only in the unprimed case. There wasn't significant evidence in the two different primed cases. So another thing that is interesting and worth mentioning is that when we compare this pure category model versus the one derived from the model, so this is the activation of the output layer of our fine-tuned AlexNet before it actually makes a decision. This is capturing some sort of difficulty of the decision or confusion between competing options. This is a better model, significantly better model of the categorical information in the brain than just the correct answer label, which was used as the training signal. So now what we want to do is look at how this interacts with the priming setup of the experiment. So as I mentioned, these priming effects, repetition suppression can be characterized as lower activations or slower activations. in the priming case, which is the orange and the green line here. Orange being 1 back primed and green being 2 back primed. Whereas in a sharpening framework, this might be faster or higher representations coming online in the case where it's primed. So here, we're going to operationalize this in the analysis as sort of the timing of this leading edge of the curve here. So we want to see, is there a significant difference between how fast the different levels of representation are coming online in the case that the stimulus was primed. So what I'm showing here are those significant differences. So for the early layer models, this is the top row, these are the lower layers, more perceptual layers in AlexNet. The priming is associated with a slower coming online, significantly slower coming online of the sort of perceptual model. So that's consistent with the sort of repetition suppression view of things. Whereas in the higher, later layers, the 1 back primed case gives you faster coming online of the more conceptual, semantic, higher level representations that's coming online. So to summarize these MEG results, we used a fine-tuned version of AlexNet to model a timeline of categorical semantic processing in a priming setup. So the artificial neural network model was a better model of the categorical information or representations in the brain than just the sort of correct answer, pure class label. Shortly after the foveal presentation of the image, about in the early period of 0 to 300 milliseconds, perceptual layers were a good match. They were better than the semantic layers, and they were slowed by a recent presence of a recent prime. So this is a sort of repetition suppression effect for low-level representations. In the later period, so 300 to 600 milliseconds, it was the higher semantic layers which were good and in some cases better than the perceptual layers. And they explained the data faster in the presence of a recent prime. So this is a sharpening for the higher level representations. So for future work with the MEG part of this, we want to move from a whole scalp sensor space analysis down to a sort of source space spatiotemporal searchlight model analysis framework, perhaps, and also look at further model development, as Dan will explain.
Yes, so we're seeing evidence of some evidence of suppression and sharpening. And just to reiterate, suppression is your activation is weaker upon re-exposure to the same stimulus, but sharpening is this idea that although the activation is weaker, maybe the signal is clearer. So how can we try to take these effects and put it into our neural networks? And is that even worth doing, basically? So modeling suppression first. This paper proposed a dynamic scheme that incorporates a suppression into the AlexNet model. So what they do is they introduce a kind of memory state which builds up to try to match the input stimulus and then deducts that off the activation. So the effect of that is if you see a stimulus for a long period of time, eventually you get bored of it and the neurons in the network turn off again. So you can see that in this this activation map that I showed earlier. This is the activation map with no suppression. And then with suppression, the neurons are bored until the scene changes and it sees a new thing and they become surprised and activated again. So this is modeling suppression, but we see no real evidence of the sharpening effect occurring here. So how can we try to build on this and then extend it to sharpening and get some scheme for that, basically? So my understanding of sharpening is you're getting some kind of quicker processing time, perhaps, in the brain. It's easier to decode what you're looking at, the visual signals. So in an artificial neural network, what would that mean? Because currently in AlexNet, we're feeding in the frames of a video one at a time. There's no information being accumulated over time. It's not increasing its classification prediction over time. It's just frame by frame, one at a time, forgetting everything each frame you saw. So in my mind, what I would like to see some dynamic scheme doing is building classification evidence over time. And I think that requires some kind of short-term memory state. So the idea is, how do we build in some kind of short-term memory state into these neural networks so that they can accumulate evidence over time for what they're seeing, for what they're trying to classify. So as I say, this is ongoing work. So we're kind of in the process of playing around with a few ideas at the moment, and we don't have any things that we're completely conclusive on yet that we're ready to show off. More just proof of concepts at the moment. So yes, does anyone have any questions?
Good question for Kanpai. So when you did your categorical RSA analysis for priming, it seemed from the graph that you take the diagonal where the images are exactly matching together with the category match. Did you do the analysis separating the exact same image and just images that match only at categorical level? So if you would remove from your analysis the diagonal of the matrix, of the RDM matrix.
Not entirely sure I follow that question, sorry.
Doesn't make sense.
So are you talking about the experiment where whether it was this identical image shown in the previous versus in the
Maybe I
same?
didn't understand the
So
experiment.
can you prime a Labrador with a dopamine?
Yes.
Yes, so that is what we're doing here. Maybe it's not totally obvious from this kind of binary matrix, but this is all of 500 different images being shown in the rows and columns. So inside one of these blocks, it is, for example, Labrador and Doberman, separate things.
So sorry to get
No,
a
please.
images. So this line here is like Labrador with Labrador.
Mhm.
So that it would be priming a Labrador with a Labrador.
Mhm.
And did you dissociate between categorical priming and identity priming?
Oh, I see. No,
Because it seems
no, we
in your
didn't.
brain RSA, when you show that beautiful animation, it seems that the identity priming line is a lot stronger than the categorical priming diagonal.
So you, if I find the slide which has the brain one going on, this here.
Yeah.
So
If you
that's
play that in.
that's true. You're talking about this sort of
Yeah.
diagonal right here.
So I was wondering just if you could dissociate the analysis, what is driven by the identity priming and what is actually driven by categorical priming, and you have all the information to do that. Just have different models to do the RSA with.
Yeah, I think that's that would be a very good idea. In this case, in this particular experiment, I'm not sure if we have enough different examples sort of counterbalanced across the different categories. I mean, yeah, there might be some way that we could adapt the analysis to that.
I did think so. You're just taking out the identity matrix out of this. You just lose the leading diagonal of the matrix. You put that as nans or whatever, so it doesn't go into it's then not part of the later correlation.
Yes, exactly. Thank you.
Sure, I see what you mean. In this particular case, that is already done in the sense that this is collapsed. So we have 15 example images from each object type, like dog, for example, and those lie within the 5 different categories. And this is the average of all of those as one experimental category because of the experimental setup. It had to be done that way, which means the diagonal is just not, it's zeros by definition here because it's just, it's the values in this RDM would be the metadata of the same thing that's being shown. So it does not contribute.
But these are very good points.
Yeah,
Just a bit of history for how we got to this paradigm. There was the thinking about circading in an image, and each time you revisit the same part of the scene, you should build up accumulation. So and then of course that would be the identical one, right? So So instead of having people circadian, we show people stuff in periphery and then the full, But of course, that doesn't mean that we cannot look at it with that sort of more higher level semantic priming and would be interesting.
So looking at the first, like the rows could be the first presentation and the columns could be the second presentation. And then the diagonal would be meaningful in terms of, the actual similarity representation.
I really like the explaining stuff. I mean, putting earlier, but that's very later, and the expression putting earlier and matching that to different layers. And I wondered, what insights can you give us about how the two things are related? Does one result in the other? Does one, what happens earlier in terms of suppression predict what's going to happen later in terms of sharpening, or like, how do you think the two, are they rising independently by some other thing, or like what's the relationship?
That's an excellent question, and I think that's what we're hoping to address with the next phase of the thing. In particular, as Dan said, when we had a network and we introduced just a kind of repetition suppression mechanism, the network representations showed no evidence of sharpening. So it's not like sharpening is coming for free just by implementing some kind of repetition suppression. So in the modeling side, I think we're looking at different ways in which that could be implemented that gives you both effects, or gives you just one, or something like that. And then, see how that unpicks the actual brain data. But I guess in terms of my intuition, I feel like they feel like the same kind of effect, as in you can potentially explain repetition suppression by a sharpening effect, as in it's pulling out just the salient features, or it's pulling out just the sort of abstracted features rather than specific features, or something like that. And characterizing, looking for repetition, suppression, and sharpening just by doing the kind of analysis we did is, I think, a good way to do it. But then you have the difficulty that lower activation always gives you slower reaching over the same level, and vice versa. So it's hard to specifically disentangle those, or I haven't thought of a way to do it yet.
Yeah, it's a bit like sort of predictive coding, the round Ballard predictive coding, that you've got the top-down representations are explaining away the lower level stuff, which is then being subtracted out. Sort of weakening representation of, so rather than having the repetition suppression being a memory at the lower levels, could it reflect the effective predictions from the higher levels? And that way the two things are sort of part of the same model rather than needing to be.
I think currently our model, what we were trying to model is implementing some kind of memory state in the higher levels. But you're saying it would be better if it is implemented at the higher levels, but does suppression on the lower levels from that, because it can, I'm not sure how to do that, but do you think that would be an interesting direction to go?
People are always talking about predictive coding, and the evidence is never very well, often not very good or confusing. So it seems that's what we have, right?
Yeah.
Just to play the devil's advocate, it's not a very popular idea, but I'm not completely convinced that sharpening always occurs together with activation suppression, because it depends. Because when you are measuring activation suppression, the way you measure it in your study, you're taking all your sensors that have captured signals from many units, the units that are tuned to the stimuli that you are interested, and units that are not tuned to the stimuli you are interested. So sharpening, it would be associated with activity suppression if the units that you are interested in the activation goes up and the others goes down. So when you measure across all units, the activation is going to come down. But if you have a different type of sharpening, where it's the signal to noise is modulated by the units that are not tuned to the image that you are predicting, you would not see necessarily activation, suppression.
Yeah.
We can talk about it later.
No, no,
It's,
I think-
it's weird to, it needs drawing to
Yeah.
explain.
No, I'm hoping that if we can move to a sort of localized source space,
Exactly.
we'll get some clearer
That
picture
is
on
so
that particularly.
interesting.
And then the question is, how can we do that in a model where there's sort of no differentiation between the, there's not like local coding within a single layer.
Mm.
So yeah, that would be tricky, but interesting.
Any other questions?
Quick one for me. For stage 2, are you still planning on using the priming paradigm? You're showing movies, and I guess with this will have to become more complicated if you're trying to.
Do you mean the tiger movie I
Yeah.
showed with the, yeah, so that was showing a version of a suppression scheme.
Right.
In future, it's not clear whether we would use that one or try and
Right, or
extend it.
something that would use static,
Yeah.
Although I guess
generalizable.
in an ideal world, you would have a movie that was the literal same sort of extended stimulus that the participants saw,
Oh yeah.
and then be able to make specific predictions about that experiment or a more naturalistic one.
Let's thank the speaker again.
Oh.